Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. I'm CNN's technology correspondent, so it's only natural that I'd want to be on a panel like this one. We'll just get the elephant in the room out of the way. There are too many men on this panel and not enough women. So we will be asking for the women who have birthed us and made the world a better place to also participate. So whenever you want, just raise your hand. I was Christiane Amanpour's producer for years, and if she saw this, she might slap me across the face. So Christiane will be giving me one for all the ladies, but we do want to hear from a few of you guys, but more of the women, please. So I just want to start by introducing our panel. We're going to be speaking with Patrick O'Donovan, the Minister of State for Public Procurement and Open Government and E-Government from Ireland. Francis Gurry, the Director General at WIPO, W-I-P-O, or the World Intellectual Property Organization. Fadi Shahadi, partner at Aubrey Partners, member of the high-level panel on digital cooperation, which is really what we're going to be discussing at the heart of our talks today. Amandeep Singh Gill, Executive Director of the Secretariat of the high-level panel on digital cooperation. And Marcus Reinisch, the Vice President of Public Policy for Europe, Middle East, and Africa, big region, for Facebook. Thank you for having us here. We'll start with you because we're really here to talk about what the United Nations is doing to create, I would say, a type of norm for the internet, really. Now, that's too broad, and so I know that you'll quickly narrow that. What exactly is the UN working on? Give us some concrete examples just to start. So we're starting with something that we can think of as being tangible in our minds. And why on the earth would somebody think that the United Nations would have the authority to be able to carry that out?
Thank you, Samuel. I think let's set this clearly from the beginning. This is not about creating a UN effort to regulate the internet or the digital world. In fact, the Secretary General was very clear from the beginning that he's very much humbly, as he said, inviting the community of business, government, and civil society players to come together and discuss how might we cooperate better to set norms for the digital world.
And is that because we already saw problems happening? This country has this set of issues, it's not cooperating with this set of issues, and we're seeing conflict.
We're seeing conflict, but we're also acknowledging that there is no clear mechanism today for business, government, and civil society to coalesce and solve issues we're facing today. Now, we have institutions and mechanisms that exist today and work quite well for what I would call the technical layers of the internet. So we all know of ICANN and the IEEE and the W3C and various organizations that have successfully created norms that frankly enable the digital world as we know it.
So why not just keep on letting them do what they've been doing?
Because their scope is limited to technical matters. As soon as we enter into societal and economic matters, there are no mechanisms to do so. So companies like Facebook, represented here by Marcus and others, really almost need on their own to come up with those rules, when in fact the Secretary General recognized by the creation of this panel that those rules are better formulated when business, government, and civil society are working together to shape these rules.
So Gil, give me an example, Mr. Gill, of the problem. What's an issue that's come up, and this is why the United Nations created this panel, to look at this, say, okay, how do we address that issue?
The problem is that the impact of digital technologies is global, crosses borders easily in nanoseconds, but the addressing of those problems is not global. So each country is left to deal with cybersecurity issues, manipulation of elections issues, undermining of trust through manipulation of public opinion, those kind of issues on its own. So when it tries to reach out across borders, there are some limitations, there are some obstacles. And our job is to find out what those obstacles are and to suggest ways to enhance cooperation to address those risks and those obstacles. Without addressing those risks, the next generation of benefits that need to be realized through the Internet of Things, through artificial intelligence, data-related application, they won't be available at scale, they won't be available to developing countries, and we won't be able to onboard the 50% who don't have access to the internet today. This is a global problem, just like climate change. It has to be addressed globally.
But give me an example. What's an example of where you're running into one of these issues? Either of you can jump in. Is it because someone's trying to buy something across the internet? Because there's a cyber weapon? What's an example of where you hit this type of issue and you say, well, there's no norm on the internet to deal with this?
So if I am the CEO of a company that has an excellent facial recognition solution, and my salespeople put in front of me a sales order for selling facial recognition to a series of countries or entities that may plan, we don't know, to use this for reasons that are against human rights.
Yeah.
What should I do? Whom do I refer to make such a decision? Is it just my shareholders who would be happy with a $100 million order? Or is it my conscience and my moral decision as an individual?
Which could be different from the guy sitting in the suite next to you or the woman sitting in the suite on the other side?
I don't know. So there are no rules for this. And right now, frankly, and maybe this is a good way to segue to Marcus, a lot of that burden to make rules is left to the companies who operate these transnational platforms.
So just to segue to the Vice President of Public Policy for Africa, you must be hearing this and thinking, why in the world would I want more rules, more regulation? I mean, so many companies just hate regulation. They want the government to get out of the way so that you can create a product for your 2.56 billion users. So you must be really nervous when you hear this.
Absolutely not. I think there is not enough regulation out there. And as Fadi says, I think,
next time Mark Zuckerberg says something, then I'll say, I think I've heard from Facebook, they don't think there's enough regulation out there.
I think there's obviously silly regulation and there's unnecessary regulation, but what we're talking about here, the fundamental questions is what kind of content should be on platforms? Who decides what kind of content is in platforms? Who executes these decisions? They are fundamental. They are bigger than a single company can ever be. That requires this intersection between lawmakers, between civil society, and between private companies. And I think this is really the challenge that we have. At the moment, that burden, to a large extent, rests on us, because we are the closest thing to a global organization, because we are a global company. And at the moment,
2.5 billion users.
It is the closest, because we are in almost all the countries in the world. And having global rules is extremely difficult, because we experience this. We have our own content standards which decide which kind of content can be distributed, which kind of content needs to be taken from the platform. And there are obviously cultural differences. There are tensions in that system. But the burden, in many respects, lies on a private company at the moment. And I think that burden needs to be shifted not just to the lawmakers, but needs to be shifted to a broader set of stakeholders. And we are very happy to do this. And we're actually already doing this. We're working with governments on trying to find new models of regulation, of new frameworks. And I think we have to move a little bit away from there's just two poles in the world. The one is companies self-regulate, and then there's hard-coded regulation. I think that world still applies in some areas, but we have to find this middle way. We have to find a way to deal with what I term the semi-public space that we have created here.
Yeah. Obviously, Facebook is changing their tune a little bit. I mean, for a long time, we heard people out of Silicon Valley, including Facebook, that they didn't want regulation. And now all of a sudden, not just Facebook is changing their tune. So many people, from Tim Cook to Mark Zuckerberg to Sheryl Sandberg, are saying, no, we do want regulation. Obviously, there have been a series of PR crises and situations that Facebook could have never seen themselves getting in. But what types of regulations do you want, and what types of regulations don't you want? You just said, I think there are some unnecessary ones. But if a group like the UN starts making these recommendations, where do you draw that line then? So I'm really curious, can you give us some examples? Facial recognition is one that was brought up. Are those the types of places where you'd like to see the regulation, and where does it not make sense?
So I'll give you one example. I think the state plays an extremely important role in setting regulations. One example is when we talk about the fundamental rights of citizens. One of the fundamental rights is privacy. I personally think, and that's a controversial view in the technology industry, but I strongly believe that only the state, only the European member states, for example, the European Union, could have set the GDPR. you could not have waited for companies or industry associations to come up with a rule that affects the fundamental rights of citizens that much. So this is an example where I think regulation is extremely well placed. There's another place where we talked about this before, hate speech, for example. We have some very draconian approaches how to regulate hate speech. In Germany, for example, where there is a hate speech law, the so-called NetzDG.
Yeah, and just to make clear the difference, I mean, for example, talking about Nazis or denying the Holocaust would start to go into that territory. Where in the United States, where I'm from, there's a book written that I read called When the Nazis Came to Skokie, Illinois, a group, a city that had many Holocaust survivors, and America prides themselves on the fact that they were allowed to march Nazis through a town with lots of Holocaust survivors. So you couldn't have two more opposed views.
Perfect.
So what does Facebook do when you have Germany on one polar end and the United States on the other side?
But let's start with the legislation itself. I think you are raising exactly the point, is what is hate speech? And quite often the responsibility of defining what these extremely fundamental concepts are is resting on our shoulders. So in Germany, for example, we have to take down hate speech without a clear definition of what hate speech is. And if we take down hate speech of right-wing group and so on, they go to court, they sue us for that, and they win in court, and the content is reinstated again. So one of the problems of bad regulation is where the intention is absolutely clear. I think we all share the same intention that hate speech has no place on a platform like ours.
So would you like the UN to define more clearly what is hate speech?
Ideally, you have global rules. But my fear from the experience that we have as a global platform to define our own community standards, our content standards, this is an extremely challenging task. But that's where it needs to go. I think we have to build this around a common set of values.
Patrick, I'm curious, when you're sitting here, we have one person representing pretty much all private industry. You've got a big burden on your shoulders, but you're you're really at the heart of government. You're working on the e-services for your country. And so when you hear these types of things, do you worry about autonomy for what you decide? I mean, right now, for example, Ireland's locked in a huge debate, even with the European Union, about what type of autonomy they have over taxation. If Apple should really be charged at 0.000, whatever it is, tax. Do you really want somebody coming in on top of the European Union then to kind of set these norms to decide what hate speech is in Ireland versus Germany versus Skokie, Illinois?
Well, first of all, I think it's an interesting conversation at an interesting time, and it is appropriate, I think, that we should start talking about this, because this is going to become the next generation problem of where does the individual states' competencies end and where does global opinion making start. And certainly from an Irish government point of view, we have taken our responsibilities within the European Union very seriously in terms of the development, for instance, of the GDPR and how that has impacted on day-to-day interaction between government and citizen and government.
General Data Protection Regulation, just in case anybody forgot.
And we shouldn't speak in speak like that. But it has had an impact in relation to how government relates with individuals, and rightly so. And I think some member states of the European Union take a totally different view from Ireland, for instance, in relation to collating of information like biometric data and information like facial recognition that can be used for engaging with the state. We don't do that because we pride ourselves very much so in terms of people's individual rights and their individual rights being protected and their data being protected. And to that end, we're just in the process at the moment of developing legislation where state entities, which are separate legal entities, government departments are separate legal entities as are state agencies, in how they interact with each other and how they translate one person's information to another department under the once only principle. So you register with the government once and all your information should be stored there, and the next time you go to a different department or agency, that information should be transferred. That's in the ideal kind of Shangri-La. Unfortunately, we don't inhabit that because there are, as they're entitled to be, individuals who believe that every time they engage with the state, they should do so on an individual basis, so their data shouldn't move. Because historically, governments haven't treated data very well. We know that there has been outages.
Nobody has treated data very well, by the best I can tell.
Industry hasn't. So there are people who naturally have an inherent fear of when they hear government swapping information, they fear that, well, where's my information going to wind up? Is it going to wind up in a refuse skip, which it has done previously? Are bank information going to wind up, blowing around in the wind or being carried in a person's briefcase, being left on a train, which has happened previously? So we take this role very seriously, as do the rest of the European Union. So it's good that the UN are talking about, how the world is going to interact. But I think this is going to be a slow burner. It's going to be a slow burner because you're going to have individual states who have different ways of dealing with it and have different ways of approaching it, even within the European Union. And if anything, history has shown us that it's going to take time because, from our point of view as a government in Ireland, we hold an awful lot of the companies, the tech companies, the leaders in the world are based in Dublin, and they reach out to the Europe, Middle East, Africa and Asia from there. So we have a big responsibility, not only in terms of our European role, but in terms of our global role to the consumers of and to the people that avail of these platforms. So this conversation is coming at a very good time for us. We're developing a GovTech strategy. We're in the middle of rolling out an eGov strategy, and we are taking the transition of what the GDPR has meant for citizens and how that is impacting on a day-to-day basis, and kind of unwinding the problems and unleashing some of the problems that it causes as a result.
Mr. Guri, given the experience that you have working at the World Intellectual Property Organization, what advice do you have for the folks on this panel? Because I assume that working with the regulations of many different countries, trying to make your point, get your money, it must be incredibly complicated. So between these lofty ideals, which I think we can agree they're lofty, you want to have lofty ideals, but when you hear terms like slow burning, I mean, it sounds like a bureaucratic nightmare. So what tips and tricks can you give us?
Well, look, I am not in a position to give advice to these gentlemen in the case, as the case is. But patience, I suppose, is one thing that one would say. But look, I think the problem is not the absence of rules. There are rules governing most of the subjects that have been mentioned by everyone. The problem is that the nature of the technologies that we have now and the nature of economic behavior and activity that we have now is that they're global. And you can't conduct an enterprise if you have 156 different forms of rules. So the problem is not the absence of rules, but some form of harmonization of rules, the conflict of rules.
Yeah.
And that's where I think this panel has a contribution to make. Because how do you develop such rules which are of global application? Well, the traditional means, which was making a treaty, really belongs to the 19th century. You have a process which is extremely slow.
The treaty is antiquated, you're saying?
Well, I think
so last century.
The treaty has limited applications now. It can't deal, at a minimum, it takes 5 years to make a treaty. Well, the world's just moved on in those 5 years. So what's really interesting about this panel is, are there other ways of developing cooperation, eventually norms, that can have a global application and that are more suited to the time speed of the movement of technology now? And to do that, well, you face a situation in which a lot of the knowledge is not in governments. It's in the private sector.
Agreed.
Who's doing what with technologies is really in the private sector. Once there was a time when governments had all the knowledge, but there's been an enormous shift of information resources towards the private sector. So you must involve them if you want to develop anything like an appropriate solution. But I agree entirely with Patrick. Here we have, this is a slow burner process, unfortunately, because getting the world to agree on anything now is a very difficult process.
It's not going to happen, realistically. I mean, realistically, that's...
Panel's over.
If we're realistically going to expect 280 countries to sign off, or however many countries to sign off in a global treaty, which you say, I mean, look at how difficult it is for us to address the single biggest issue that's facing this planet at the moment in terms of climate change. And are we seriously suggesting that we're going to have a norm across every state in the world on how the state and the businesses in the state collect and use data? So at best, what we can have are acceptable norms, respectable norms, where the citizen is at the core, and respecting the citizen and the citizen's right and the citizen's data is at the core. Because you're absolutely right. If we are to sit down in the morning and have a global conference on what is the legal norm, the legal as opposed to the acceptable norm for the dealing of individuals' data and the monitoring and oversight and governance of companies and what they must do, well, you know, there's wishful thinking and there's wishful thinking.
I mean, one thought I have on this is about approach and process. I mean, let's be honest, this is not a completely new development. You know, there have been technologies in the past that had sort of good and bad impacts on society. And I take the one is the car.
The internet?
The internet, yeah, well, that's the one we're talking
Yeah.
about. But the car, for example, you know, people die in traffic accidents, and it's a fantastic method to connect and to be with people. And what has happened, and I think this is a fantastic example, we have rules. We have, you know, speed limits, we have drink driving rules and so on. These are state rules. This is the hard-coded regulation, you know, sort of the equivalent of the GDPR that we mentioned before. But the seatbelt, the airbag, the ABS was not developed by regulators. That was developed by the industry and then has been standardized by the state and by the regulators. And I think we are at a similar point here, that we actually have to look at those people who have the experience, who have the innovative drive. And this is actually something we are doing right now with the French government, where we take exactly the other approach to what happened in Germany with the hate speech law. Rather than having a very formulaic, undefined hate speech law, we have invited representatives of the French government, of the French regulator, to come to spend time with us in California, in Ireland, and to actually understand how content is moderated, what abilities, what functionalities it has, and then build rules based on experience, or not from a top-down approach that is too abstract and too far removed from actually the reality. So that is an approach.
I want to bring another elephant in the room into clear light. I think there are a lot of asymmetries in the world, and we have big tech that has the capacity. Facebook has more than 1,000 people looking at content. Most governments,
30,000.
Yes,
I was about to say, trust me, they'll email me about that one afterwards.
So most governments don't have a dozen people looking at those issues, and they're dealing with huge complexities. India has 200 million plus WhatsApp users, and there's one representative from WhatsApp in India. So we've heard on our journeys across the globe, governments complain that tech is deciding for us, that governance is coming wrapped in technologies. Code is law, platform is politics. So there is an asymmetry situation here. And 150 plus countries, the EU is fortunate that they have capacities to enforce laws, and that is a good thing. But then there is also this fragmentation across the world. The norms are not equally applied. They're not equally available. They are not equally applied. So our challenges, as Francis was saying, so we have these 20th century policy tools which are not up to the challenge, and we have to now scramble to put together new ways of cooperation that work for everyone.
So what I hear you saying is that people might be more keen to get on board with this than we might think, because we've heard a Facebook representative say here, we don't mind some of these rules. And in fact, to your point, we know that Facebook has announced that they'll enforce GDPR to different extents worldwide. And it sounds like governments want to be involved. I want to get your point, but I've heard from a lot of men, so I'd like to hear from a woman and then get back to a man. If we can have a microphone over here. Introduce yourself.
Yes, so I'm Monique Morrow. Hello.
We'll get to you, don't worry.
Well, you know what? I will defer. Okay. And I'm Monique Morrow, and I'm president of the Vetri Foundation, and also based in Zurich, and proud to be in the room with one of the premier privacy experts in the room, who is Katrina. I hear a lot of different things here around the polarity between, governance, digital governance, and so on. I think that's what I hear is fundamentally the systems that we know today are creaking. They're just no longer applicable. And citizens, I've worked in private sector, are probably a little bit concerned about things happening to them. Mm-hmm. You get a notice and someone's privacy has been, egreged, with no point to agree. You know, who do you agree? Who do you actually report to, for example? And so it is about putting digital citizens it is about putting citizens in the center of that universe. I have spoken to people who are just so used to, and that scares me a little bit, of being hacked.
They get the emails all the time.
They get the emails all the time, and it's like, I'm used to it.
Yeah.
And so I think we have to be responsible here. Yes, it's about regulatory tech. How, you know, it's that, you know, what skill sets do leaders of today need to have for the future? That's one thing. And the other is this, it is multi-stakeholder. You do need the industry, but on the other hand, it is moving fast. And I think it is about putting the consumer, the individual in that center, where that consumer and individual can respond. It's not about giving me my privacy data from Facebook, which I've seen before, which doesn't make sense to me. But it's about actually how do you put that together where the individual is in the center, where that individual has a course of action, other than hearing that so-and-so, you know, every day is a hack, every day, you know, privacy is a human right. We can actually start with that. It is a human right. We could say privacy is a human right if we agree. And it's about moving that conversation forward.
I just want to follow up on one thing you said. You said leaders who need the skill set.
Yes, I do.
Did you mean government leaders?
Government leaders,
business?
absolutely. Rec tech. You've got to have some sort of technology acumen in where we're at. You just cannot have individuals. I'm working with parliamentarians today where they are techie savvy. They are able to pose the questions to Zuckerberg,
after
for
Mark
example.
Zuckerberg's testimony, we saw some senators who didn't know even how Facebook made money.
These are
it was very concerning.
Let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's moving toward leadership. Otherwise, you're not going to have a cogent conversation, right?
Thank you.
Yeah, can I follow up from this? Because we're looking at another set of things which goes far beyond content. And that was your last sentence, or what you said, how Facebook makes money. Because I'd be interested in your comment on another thing that's happening in Germany, and that is the antitrust law. And the issue is, you know, what do you do with the masses of data that you have available, and how do you combine them? So that, you know, the Facebook data is linked to the WhatsApp data, is linked to whatever else data. And so I just want to highlight that there's different areas of regulation that are being touched here. And initially, we didn't even think that, you know, the fact that you have all this data, not just you, others as well, can lead to totally new sets of regulation. And what that means, that goes far beyond privacy, that goes far beyond content, and is a very important cross-border issue. How do you make money? Of what do you make money? And can anybody, you know, have a say in relation to that? So I'd like to hear how you are responding to this antitrust move that is emerging.
I'm going to give Mr. Reinisch a chance to respond directly to that, but I see you wanting to jump in. So, shall I let him go first?
Ahead, yeah.
So in case anybody's not clear about what our colleague here is talking about, the data sharing between WhatsApp and Facebook. If somebody WhatsApps you now, you might all of a sudden say, Samuel, do you want to be friends with Marcus on Facebook? And some people feel that was that Mark Zuckerberg said that wouldn't happen, that they would keep this data separate, which is going to be, you know, for people much more powerful than me to decide. So it does get to a core fundamental, even about data sharing within the same company is becoming a point, as pointed out by the audience.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to start from and come to the point from what you said before about knowledge and sort of tech literacy, because that links very nicely to the FCO case as well. I agree with you. I think there's not enough knowledge out there. So I joined Facebook a year ago from the telecoms world, and I dealt with, sorry for that, I dealt with literate regulators. And it
illiterate regulators.
With literate regulators.
Oh, with literate
Yes,
regulators.
yes.
Okay.
And
in the telecoms world.
In the telecoms
I see what
world.
you mean.
And at the moment, I deal with very excited politicians. quite often, and government departments who try their best, but they are not at that level where a regulator is necessarily. And I think this is one of the big problems where we are, that we don't have the human brain power at the moment to really deal and stick to a subject as well, which is very susceptible to political and populist movements. So this is a point, and this brings me now to the FCO case. So as you say, the FCO case is about sharing of data within the family of Facebook platforms, but also with other services, with off-platform services, as we call this. This is not a competition case. This is a privacy case. First thing is, this is very dangerous if we are starting meddling different rules with different regulators, and also different skills of regulators, because competition authorities are not privacy authorities. And this is where this comes in. Yeah. And it is, I have the highest regard and respect for the German Bundeskartellamt. I am, for all my sins, actually a trained competition lawyer myself. That case is not defendable because it's a political case at the end of the day.
But it could be a privacy case.
And it is a privacy case, and it's a privacy case that is almost irrespective of the GDPR. And this is, again, closely to loop back to you. The GDPR is the tool that brings the customer to the center of the decision making. The user is the center. Yeah. And I think that we need to respect this, because a lot has happened since the introduction of the GDPR. A lot has happened for us. This was one of the biggest efforts in the company to become GDPR compliant. As you say, roll the settings of the GDPR out globally, not just in Europe. And I think we need to be very, very careful that we're not using some very, very powerful tools, mixing them up for trying to fix a problem that is very ambiguous. And that's as we discussed here.
Just out of fairness, though, I do want to represent the other side as best I can journalistically. Some people say it's very hard to compete with Facebook, given that you guys have such large apps like WhatsApp. How do I compete with Facebook and create another social network when Facebook, with its 2 billion users, can get the other information from WhatsApp then? So that's some of the competition. I'm not a competition lawyer, but...
There are, on average, 8 to 9 apps that compete with us.
Yeah.
And the data that we hold is not proprietary data. This is the interesting thing. If you are a car manufacturer and you know exactly the diagnostic data or something, that is data that really prevents another competitor from getting access to this. The data that we hold, the telcos hold it, app providers hold it, and so on. So I think we have to be really clear what the case really is here. It is not that we are sitting on huge amounts of data that nobody has access to. We have access to the same data that anybody else could and has, actually.
I'll go to you quickly, and then we'll go into the audience again, Mr. Guri.
Okay. I just wanted to say the competition law is a great illustration of the central problem that's being addressed by the panel. Because competition law is jurisdictional. That is, every country has its competition law. And it considers the market to be the market in its country. Or, in the case of the European Union, the market in the European Union. But quite obviously, the competition question is a global question with global companies. But there is no mechanism to be able to deal with a global market as opposed to individual markets. One other brief comment, if I may, on the GDPR. Look, I think we also have to ask the question, what happens if you don't have global rules? What happens if you don't have global rules is that there is a big advantage for the first mover, provided the first mover has the scale. Now, let's all just assume that
they've got the scale.
They've got the scale.
Let's all
assume that the GDPR is a great piece of legislation. I've got no, problems with it. But effectively, because of the scale of the European Union, it becomes the global rule. Everyone has to comply because they all want to be.
And that is indeed what's happening.
And that's indeed what's happening.
And I just, to interject once, I have to say, a lot of smaller companies tell me, including in this region, that it's very costly for them to comply with it. Now, Facebook can afford to, not to pick on Facebook, Facebook can afford to, Google can afford to easily 10 times over.
Right.
For a smaller company, I've heard from
difficult.
startup leaders here in the region who said, this has cost me a lot of money.
And in what happens if China introduces a different form?
That's a good question.
Or if the United States introduces a different form, or India introduces a different form, and there's great considerations in India.
And consumer protection is now mixing up with competition policy, no longer kosher.
True.
We have a member in the panel, Jean Tehol, Nobel Prize winning economist, one of the leading authorities on this question. So the EU, Brussels, is looking at how do you get the two to work together. So there will be new ways in which these things will mix up together, because there are unintended consequences on a fair marketplace regionally within the EU and across the globe. Most people in Africa think the digital transformation is happening to them. They don't have agency over it. So people are going to get at it from whichever angle they can, including competition policy and new ways of mixing it with.
To you, Mr. O'Donovan, and then we'll go next to the esteemed guest in the audience, and then right there.
Well, just to introduce another elephant in the room, considering there's a couple of elephants already.
There are a lot of elephants for such a small
There's no more room.
There's
no more room for
elephants.
I just thought it was the lack of men on the panel.
Yeah. Well, I have
Women, sorry.
I have to defend my esteemed colleagues from around the world, those political representatives, because ordinarily we are democratically elected. So we are a reflection of the people who elect us.
Hopefully.
And to say, that you need a particular competence to take up a political role is something I totally disagree with. Because in a parliamentary democracy, which most countries are in the world now, particularly in the developed world, the government is derived from Parliament, and it's a reflection really of the people of the country. So, I'm Minister in Ireland for e-government, but I come from an appalling background of industrial chemistry. So do I have a competence in the area of tech development as we know today? No, I don't. But the advisors and the policymakers and the policy assistants that I have around me have, and they interact with private sector, with academia, with all of the other competencies that they need to. And ultimately, I make policy and present the policy to government and to our parliament based on the reflections that I have there. So do I have the skill sets to do that? Absolutely. And I think most democracies around the world do have that. But just going back to where competition meets consumer protection, in our jurisdiction, as is the case in many other European jurisdictions, there is no difference. Consumer authorities and competition authorities are the one, because there is no differentiation between the consumer and the citizen. They are the one, and it is ultimately the protection of the citizen first and consumer second, and the actual definition of what is the person that's dealing with the particular consumable that's on offer, whether it's Facebook or whether it's WhatsApp. It is a citizen at the end of the day, and it's enshrined in law and in most countries under the GDPR developed by the European Union that it is citizen first. And I think once that narrative is there, citizen first, as opposed to talking about the citizen as a consumer, that you don't get lost in that fog.
If I can have you say your name and your title, since plenty of the people in the audience are leaders in their field as well.
Sure. My name is Nanjira. I'm actually a member of said panel. And had I walked into this room without context, I would think we were talking about the European cooperation on privacy and competition, and not on digital cooperation in the international sense. And I think this is just a representation of the glaring challenge we have with this conversation, that we want to achieve something that is international, but the perspectives that are shaping the discourse are quite Eurocentric, or in other cases Americentric. And I actually would like to challenge our esteemed discussants here to feedback what they're hearing in the global settings that they're working in, maybe with the exception perhaps from country context, but many others are having to represent Europe, Middle East, Africa. You members of the panel, global bodies, what are you hearing from the other side? Because to listen to this conversation on privacy and competition, I happen to come to a part of the world that is being connected through the Facebook family of groups. So privacy, competition, all of that is one big regulatory mess for all of us. Facebook and that set of companies is the internet for people. So we're dealing with a very different situation here. So when we talk about international cooperation, while we do draw a lot from the European and the Americentric perspectives, we are risking a huge failure of imagination and global governance going forward if we don't flip the discourse to think about those who are still not connected, those who have been connected in a very privatized, corporatized way. And I'd like that conversation to proceed with that going forward.
And just for clarity, for more context on it, so when you mean, and I'll give you a chance
those who are
to
left
respond.
behind, really.
Say that again?
Those who are left behind, or those who are not coming to the table, or to connectivity, if you will, in this case, from the same footing as other regions have. We're not coming from backgrounds where people have tried to build a Facebook of, nor is the future of international platforms or anything we use going forward the Facebook of, I don't know, Africa, or the Facebook of wherever. It is a bit more difficult to talk about new entry points to where Facebook got to, and trying to reimagine that open space that created that, and then that has centralized and created platforms that are a conceptualization of the internet. Going forward, what does that mean for the same things we we want to tell governments to do, whether it's governments in certain regions that are having this experience versus those who, are on a different experience. And I think if nothing else, if we leave this room having understood that international cooperation has to stop being a top-down imposition of what's worked and start flipping the fact that there are people who are continuously in sites of exploitation and appropriation and having to adopt to whatever is there as a technology, we may have a different way to think about how to come towards global rules and standards.
And I think what was mentioned on this panel too is playing out exactly in what you're complaining about, and possibly rightfully so, is the fact that by de facto, by the EU creating GDPR and the fact that it usurped the United States in a way, that we're living in a world that has a very big possibility of being set by European norms.
One avenue, and I know that the flip side to that discourse is everyone's fearing what happens when China enters the game in the same regions.
As you mentioned.
There's a minor point here, China. We're not talking about how small...
Another elephant in the room.
How small Facebook is compared to some Chinese companies. So, tiny. If you look at the number of users some of the Chinese companies have today and will have tomorrow, then we should really be careful how we focus on a company or on a set of companies that are susceptible to abide by European rules. The reality is, I think the speaker is spot on in saying we need to start thinking at a global level, because companies, innovation that may change something like facial recognition may come out of a small group of 30 very smart engineers in Namibia.
What do you...
How are we going to regulate that? Why are we all focused on the easy targets when in reality we need rules that can apply globally? I think that's the message that's being sent.
And what do you think is one of the solutions to make sure that all of the communities are addressed in these types of norms?
It starts with little things, and it can go micro, macro. It's representation. Who's not in the room, and how do you make sure their perspectives are in that room? That has to be something. We can't have ethereal responses about global futures we want when even in the rooms we're gathering, the representation we have to get those perspectives is still problematic. It starts with the simple steps that if we can't take them here, we can't get to those norms, because what happens is then you get a continuous backlash that this is all an imposition on the future coders. If we come up with standards about ethics that we must train people to, and they're like, well, other people got to tinker with the world and, ethics were not being played at. Why should we be the ones to adhere to it as late adopters, if you will? Those are the realities that will manifest themselves in big and small ways. But the entire conceptualization of everything from what we think about international use of the word international cooperation, and I guess digital to tie it all together, if we don't change how we are approaching that discourse, and I shouldn't have to be always the reactionary dissenting voice. How do we flip that and I'm the proactive shaping and framing voice in the room, and not just me as an individual, but the people who are not in this room? That might be the better way and more intellectually honest way to achieve the goals we have ahead of us.
Although, in fairness, I need to say this. The World Government Summit here in Dubai has been, as a high-level summit, frankly, a place that is more open and more inclusive than most high-level summits I've been to. There are people from around the world, especially from parts of the world that typically we don't see in these types of meetings. So frankly, I mean, not that I have no connection to this, not a plug, but simply to thank the organizers for opening that forum. I've seen people from parts of the world at this forum that I haven't seen in other places. It strengthens, we need to do more of it. I agree with you, we need to have more people around this table. But I think it's very important to remember the following. We cannot spend our time pointing the finger at one group or one company or one sector. This is time, and as the Secretary General has asked us to do in this panel, to bring together some real practical mechanisms that allow us to start solving these problems together. This is the moment to do that. I think companies, you would not have heard Marcus or someone in Marcus's position say that 2 years ago. You would not have heard that a year ago. I think we are in a different time. Companies are, Tim Cook announced publicly, we need more regulations. When is the last time you heard the CEO of any company?
And Facebook as well.
Say,
And Facebook as well.
So I think we're in a moment of opportunity. Let's grab it. Let's work with the companies. Let's work with the government. And let's not hope for some top-down solution. The solutions will start at the absolute most basic place, bottom up. They will rise. All the Secretary General is asking us to do is to provide a framework for solutions to come from the bottom up.
I want to turn to the audience again. Again, if you can just introduce yourself, name, title, the whole kit and caboodle, please.
Hi, Katrina Dow, CEO of MECO. To follow on from the last two comments and including this bottom up, I think one of the challenges, we have a first principle problem. And we need to be, if we go back to the idea of the car, and you introducing that concept, I feel like what we're trying to do is put an engine into a horse in a lot of ways, in that we have infrastructure, we have regulation, we have a particular way of working. Instead of us having this a presence of mind that we're at this inflection point in society where we actually have to go back to first principles. And that is a child born today in a developing country, in a developed country, will probably have pre-birth a digital persona before maybe even being physically on this planet. And when we physically leave, our digital lives remain. And so I think this idea of each of us every day is generating a digital twin. And we have spent thousands of years working to address the asymmetry of labor, the rights of one man over another, rights to freedom, many, many things around our physical selves. And we moved so quickly into this other paradigm, into this digital paradigm, with part of our physical selves giving up many of those first principles. And I think regulation, I think the great thing about GDPR is it started this discussion. And even when I hear put the customer, the citizen, the patient, the student at the center, it's still not in the value chain. There's still this hierarchy where something's happening around the person and we're putting them in the middle, as opposed to saying, if we want a free, open, connected digital market, if we want this in Europe, and we want to be able to co-create and use data for better education, health, societal outcomes, then we have to find a way to put our digital selves directly into that value that's created. And I don't mean through selling data or moving from one model to the other, but this issue of first principle and asymmetry. If we're not having those conversations, we'll try and have great band-aids that are regulatory. We will protect people in one border and then render them vulnerable in another. And the world is changing so fast, regulation can't even keep up. The kinds of conversations we need to have are, what does it mean for a human to have a dual existence that is omnipresent across borders, simultaneous, constantly? What does that mean for rights, agreements, property, IP, decisions, delegation? And these types of things, if we start to think about what that means, it will frame a different kind of conversation as well.
And one of the most interesting aspects of that is what happens when your digital profile, if it's a government that has a profile, has incorrect information, and that your digital twin isn't really your twin. It's not an identical twin. It's a huge ethical question. We could go on much longer than this panel. Yeah, here, I'll just, thank you.
First of all, I do want to commend the panelists, even though we're back here, but it's been a very interesting conversation. Listen, I want to go back to a point that was earlier made, because it's about representation on who's being represented. I'm with a colleague from Kinshasa. I'm going to parse you. She's a scientist, and she doesn't feel represented here in this discussion. I really want to say, we were talking in French before. We met at a UNESCO summit, AI for Africa, and that was a huge discussion. And so let me just say that if we're going to end this, we ended on a note where the next time we have something of this nature, that it is totally inclusive, include China in the discussion and so on, and it will be even more richer conversation.
I think it's
Thank you.
a
Good point.
totally fair point.
Good point.
I'd like to go over here for also men from the audience too.
Thank you. I'll be brief. I know that you don't have much time. Denis Hussar from the United Nations. My question is to Mr. Gil and maybe to Fadi. You know that we have also Internet Governance Forum, which is convened by the Secretary General, and the last meeting took place in Paris, and the next one will be in Berlin this coming November. And after the Paris, there was a Paris call by President Macron. 68 states signed it, including 328 sectors, private sectors, including Facebook and Microsoft. Brad Smith is advocating for that. So, and there are already regulations, legislation, and we have a ICT for Development resolution every year at the UN where all 193 member states come and sign. So my question is, and also bringing back to the original goal of the panel, high-level cooperation. So where do you see Internet Governance Forum in all these discussions, and what is not working and what will come out of this panel? Maybe if you can brief comment on the future ideas, what's coming in May. Thank you.
Do you want to take that?
So the IGF, or the Internet Governance Forum, is a very valuable platform that exists today where people come together and shape new norms or new ideas to solve digital issues. I just don't believe that it will be the only such platform. I think many of us believe that there is a need for a distributed set of platforms that can produce things around the world, not just for those who show up at the IGF. So the plurality of platforms is very important. Now, of course, when you have anything distributed, you need some coherence. You need, I wouldn't use the word harmonization quite, but coherence is needed across all of these platforms. And so part of what we're designing for the Secretary General is an approach to leverage what the IGF is doing, but also accept what so many other platforms could be producing. Some of them may be more local in Africa or in other parts of the world, or some of them sectorial. We should accept that there will be a plurality of and then to the points about really the diversity, I just want to, sitting here easily in the circle, I want to second them and support you on the idea that we need to have more of your voices here next time. And some of the organizers are in the room, so we will pass this to them and make sure they appreciate it.
Yeah, and the buck stops with me as well. I was really privileged to work for one of the leading icons of journalism, and so it's on me, and I will make sure that it's addressed, and the buck stops here. Go ahead.
It's the point about weaponization of software security, the Paris call that the gentleman referred to. I think that's one of those global questions where norms are contested, where trust is eroding, and there are new forms of security challenges that are arising through artificial intelligence, new forms of offense and defense in cyber weaponry. So there is even more urgency in terms of setting some ground rules, some norms, and then having mechanisms to have accountability under those norms.
Mr. O'Donnell wants to reply, and then I'll go right over there.
It's actually a question, you know. I mean, we've had a very good discussion here in relation to, you know, where do we go from here to try and harmonise rules across. We know that the treaty element has gone out the window. So from the World Government Summit, like, what's the next step from the World Government Summit in terms of, you know, us as governments getting advice from industry, getting advice from academia, getting advice from civil society? Like, does this conversation end when we walk out the door now from a World Government Summit point of view, or is there a natural place where this conversation can continue? And is there going to be a sharing of information post the World Government Summit? Because if there isn't, that creates a bigger problem, because as you said a while ago, technology is actually running faster than the length of this meeting. So if we're going to go down the road of legislative regulations, by the time I reach the door, the legislative regulations that I would draft are obsolete. So where does this conversation go after here?
I want to go to the audience for 1 second.
First of all, thank you to the esteemed panelists and all these excellent questions. It's been a fantastic conversation. Also, I'm a huge fan of Amandeep. I'll just say that, and thank you so much to the UN for the groundbreaking work you're doing in this area. I work with IEEE, the world's largest engineering association. We're doing a lot of work on what we call data agency. And to build off of the last comment, a next step, some recommendations and then also questions to the panelists if this makes sense for the work that you're doing. There's an organization called mydata.org that started in Helsinki. They're doing a lot of work with the groundbreaking Cross-X program with Tallinn, Estonia, showing how two countries can exchange data in a peer-to-peer way, also with smart cities and governments. Tallinn, obviously a very specific small country, but people actually own their data. That's always very problematic. But the point is MyData, the organization, is getting a lot of federated, both European and now beyond European, Japan and other countries, to decide ways that people can have a trusted identity source tied to their identity and then do peer-to-peer exchange of data in concert with great services that are offered.
And does a lot of that revolve around blockchain?
Well, that's what I was going to ask you is, when I'm at the geeky conferences, you'll get into a 7-hour conversation about why blockchain won't work, et cetera. However, the whole suite of things like blockchain, what's called sovereign data tools, out of MIT, there's something called smart contracts, meaning the technological interoperability of the solutions to offer people data agency is here. Those things exist. They work. Do they work well all the time? No. Can things be hacked? Of course. It's called reality. But the point is the entire paradigm of all of the things, the GDPR, and Paul Nemitz is a rock star. He's the Eric Clapton of data. He's the architect of the GDPR. Here to stay, fantastic. But companies like Katrina, she didn't say this, Miko, and these other solutions do allow parity to happen, where individuals can say, these are my values, this is who I am, whether you're in Africa or United States or anywhere else. So how is this factoring into legislation is my question. Because a lot of times in these amazing panels, the focus is on GDPR, which it should be, but I don't hear enough about how about these solutions that are already working, smart chains, sovereign data, blockchain. That industry is here, it's flourishing. This needs to be talked at this level so these solutions can be offered to individuals, and I'm wondering how that could happen. And again, thank you very much.
Thank you. I think that's going to have to be one of you two who picked that up.
Right. Well, I mean, national laws are being updated, and some of that is addressing that question in India, in Brazil, in Southeast Asia, in Africa. But then I think we have spoken a lot about regulation in this panel, not enough about agency and the right use cases, because you need to give agency to those who are being protected through the regulations. So I think that is a set of experiments being conducted outside the legal domain through digital public goods, enablers, where civil society plays a role. And so these are the softer tools of governance that are being invented. Maybe Fadi.
I will just add, and thank you for your comments, and frankly for the great work IEEE does in this area. You see, what this gentleman explained is a very good example of what we're facing. There is great work happening in so many places. How many of us here in this room, who are insiders to a large degree, have heard about the work you just introduced to us? Couple. Hence the problem. The problem is that we need a way to take all the great work happening in so many places. Here in this conference, 2 days ago, the AI work that occurred here, and we heard the rapporteurs this morning report on it, is incredible, just incredible work. The rest of the world still has to catch up with it. What is needed is a mechanism to connect the dots, to explain to people what is available, what is knowledgeable, and that would be a great thing if the UN panel recommends to the Secretary General the creation of some kind of an observatory, some kind of a network of networks, as we're calling it, that brings all of this to the fore, so that then governments may choose to take this and make it a law, or maybe not. That's up to governments. But that's important, because the decoupling of the work to create norms at the speed of the internet from the enforcement of these norms is a very important point, right? We need to decouple these. We need to move at the speed of the internet to create norms, and then let the legislative process pick that up as it sees fit at its slower pace. That's one of the key recommendations we are working on for the Secretary General.
And when can we expect it to conclude?
Our plan is to deliver the report at the end of May, and hopefully it'll be public in June.
Well, I'm intrigued and somewhat surprised that actually so many people are on the same page in this room. It seems almost everybody, maybe about how to get there is different, but the fact that we need to get there, whether it's government or industry or these regulatory bodies.
But 6 months ago, you would not have gotten us all on the same page. I just need to keep emphasizing that we are in a window of opportunity where governments, businesses, and civil society have a moment to actually shape the digital order moving forward, and it's now. If we do not take advantage of the fact Microsoft, Apple, Facebook, Baidu, Tencent, Jack Ma, who's on our panel, all these leaders are saying, it is time. Let's take advantage of it.
I want to thank everybody on the panel, and by everybody on the panel, I mean the entire room. Thank you for participating. And I meant what I said, the buck stops with me, so you can definitely come to me, and I'll be talking with the organizers as well. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. Great job.